Before the eyes of hundreds of my kin, my fiancé, the exalted Silver Moon Wolf King, ruthlessly tore up our fated bond. He mocked me as nothing more than a frail, useless wretch with only beauty to her name, then turned to embrace a coarse female warrior, declaring her his new queen. The backlash from the severed bond left me in agony, and everyone assumed I would collapse in the freezing snow, groveling and begging for mercy. But the very instant he announced the annulment, every torch in the arena was instantly extinguished, and a terrifying, crushing pressure pinned every werewolf present immovably to the ground. His most dreaded nemesis, the legendary Blood Shadow Wolf King, a figure said to kill without blinking and rule with savage ruthlessness, stepped out of the darkness. Ignoring the collective horror of the crowd, the terrifying Demon King walked straight toward me and dropped to one knee in the freezing snow. Right in front of that scoundrel, he forcefully, and possessively, sank his fangs into the nape of my neck, branding me with the mark of the highest tier soul bond. The cast-off he discarded like a worthless rag is the very deity I have spent half a lifetime searching for. From this day forth, should anyone dare to make her shed a single tear, I will wipe the entire Silver Moon clan from the face of the earth. Upon seeing the mark on my neck, the scoundrel went completely mad. Yet, he had no idea that provoking this bloodthirsty nemesis was merely the beginning of the nightmare that would destroy his clan, nor did he realize that the pure, divine power coursing through my veins, a power capable of destroying everything in its path, had only just begun to awaken. Welcome to Luna's Secret Library. On this channel, you can enjoy all sorts of romantic love stories. If you like my stories, please subscribe to my channel for more wonderful tales. The icy winter wind bit viciously through my thin silk dress. I stood completely frozen in the center of the ancient stone circle. Tonight was the sacred winter solstice gathering. It was the one night the moon goddess revealed true fated mates to the world. Arthur stood just 3 feet in front of me. He was the alpha of the Silver Crescent pack and the man I had loved since childhood. His broad, muscular shoulders were draped in a heavy, majestic wolf pelt. His piercing golden eyes stared down at my trembling frame. But there was absolutely no warmth or love in his harsh gaze. There was only a cold, calculating disgust that made my stomach churn. The entire pack surrounded us in the frozen, darkened woods. Hundreds of powerful wolves held their breath in the absolute silence. The sacred silver moonlight washed over both of us like a divine waterfall. It created a glowing, undeniable ethereal tether between our two hearts. The goddess had spoken her ultimate truth. I was his deeply fated, perfectly matched mate. I was young, universally considered beautiful, and possessed a flawless lineage. My dark hair cascaded down my back like a midnight waterfall. My skin was as flawless and pale as the fresh winter snow beneath our feet. I smiled softly, taking a hopeful step forward to accept his eternal claim. I, Alpha Arthur, publicly reject you, Evelyn. His voice boomed like thunder. Those brutal words struck me like a physical, crushing blow to the chest. My breath violently caught in the back of my throat. A collective, shocked gasp rippled immediately through the gathered crowd. I froze completely, my hands still reaching out helplessly toward him. You are incredibly weak, Arthur declared loudly for everyone to hear. You are nothing but a pretty, useless face, he added with a cruel sneer. The Silver Crescent needs a ruthless warrior queen, not a delicate, fragile flower. Unbearable pain exploded like a grenade inside my chest. It felt exactly as if my ribs were being torn apart from the inside out. This was the horrific physical agony of a severed soul bond. Arthur did not even flinch at my obvious suffering. He callously turned his broad back on me. He reached into the stunned crowd and pulled forward a tall, heavily scarred woman. It was Beatrice, his notoriously brutal lead fighter. This is the strong Luna I choose for myself, Arthur announced to the heavens. My weak knees finally gave out, hitting the freezing stone floor hard. A burning humiliation seared across my pale cheeks. Hot tears pricked my eyes, but I fiercely refused to let them fall. I would never give that arrogant monster the satisfaction of my tears. The older elders of the pack looked away in profound shame. But absolutely no one dared to challenge the alpha's ruthless decision. I was entirely, devastatingly alone in the center of the world. I had been discarded like a piece of worthless, broken glass. My beautiful winter gown suddenly felt like a heavy mourning shroud. I refused to lower my head to the stone. I kept my spine perfectly straight despite the agonizing pain in my soul. If I was to be a rejected mate, I would be a queen in my own ruin. The surrounding wolves murmured in soft, sickening pity. Pity was a toxic poison I simply would not drink. Suddenly, the burning torches around the stone circle flickered and died. The ambient temperature plummeted instantly to a bone-chilling extreme. A suffocating aura of pure, suffocating dark power flooded the clearing. It was undeniably an alpha aura, but infinitely darker and stronger than Arthur's. Every single wolf in the pack dropped instinctively to their knees in submission. Even the arrogant Arthur stumbled backward, his face rapidly draining of all color. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed from the dense, black shadows of the tree line. The sound was slow, agonizingly rhythmic, and utterly terrifying. A towering figure emerged slowly into the pale, shifting moonlight. He was massive, with raven-black hair and eyes that glowed like liquid silver. It was Silas. He was the exiled, legendary alpha of the Blood Shadow Pack. He was Arthur's greatest, most lethal, and most hated enemy. Silas was a walking monster plucked straight from our darkest childhood legends. He was a ruthless killer who was rumored to destroy entire packs without a second thought. Why was this demon standing here on our sacred, heavily guarded ground? Arthur bared his sharp teeth, shifting halfway into his monstrous wolf form. You dare trespass on my sovereign territory, Silas? Arthur snarled, though his voice trembled. Silas did not even bother to look at the pathetic alpha. His glowing silver eyes were locked entirely and obsessively on me. He completely ignored the hundreds of growling, terrified wolves surrounding him. He walked with deadly grace straight through the center of the sacred circle. He stopped right in front of my trembling, kneeling form. His imposing, muscular figure cast a long, protective shadow over my body. He slowly and deliberately knelt down on one knee in the snow. He brought his intimidating face perfectly level with mine. Up close, his overwhelming masculine scent was incredibly intoxicating. It smelled dangerously of dark pine, violent winter storms, and raw, unrestrained power. He actually threw away a flawless diamond, Silas whispered, his voice a deep, rough velvet. Because he was simply too blind to see its true worth, he continued, his eyes tracing my features. I stared helplessly into his silver eyes, mesmerized by the primal hunger lurking there. Who are you to him now, little bird? Silas asked softly, brushing a tear from my cheek. Nothing, I breathed out, the painful word tasting like dry ash in my mouth. Silas smiled, revealing a sharp, deeply predatory curve of his handsome lips. Good, he murmured, his voice rumbling deep in his chest. He reached out with a large, incredibly warm, calloused hand. His remarkably long fingers gently but firmly tilted my chin upward. A strange, electrical heat immediately rushed through my frozen veins at his sudden touch. The searing, bond-breaking pain in my chest miraculously vanished. It was instantly replaced by a wild, terrifying, and exhilarating new pulse. Get your filthy hands away from her! Arthur roared furiously, lunging forward blindly. Silas didn't even turn his head to acknowledge the threat. He simply flicked his thick wrist with terrifying casualness. A massive wave of sheer kinetic force slammed violently into Arthur's chest. The mighty alpha was thrown backward through the air like a ragdoll. He crashed sickeningly into a heavy stone pillar 10 feet away. The entire Silver Crescent pack whimpered collectively in absolute, paralyzing terror. Silas leaned in much closer to my trembling body. His hot breath fanned tantalizingly across the highly sensitive skin of my neck. "You are no longer his trash to discard, Evelyn," Silas growled against my collarbone. He roughly brushed my dark hair aside, completely exposing my bare, vulnerable shoulder. "You are now mine to eternally worship," he declared loudly for the entire forest to hear. I gasped loudly as I felt his incredibly sharp, elongated fangs graze my racing pulse point. He did not ask for my permission as his jaw opened wider. Silas sank his fangs violently and deeply into my sweet mating gland. A blinding, overwhelming flash of dark ecstasy and pure power completely eradicated my sorrow. The rejected girl died in the snow, and a dark king's obsession was born. The bite of his sharp teeth was a shocking collision of pain and extreme pleasure. It felt like a violent, beautiful lightning strike straight to my very soul. The agonizing void left by Arthur's cruel rejection was instantly filled to the brim. Silas was aggressively pouring his terrifying, ancient power directly into my veins. The mating bond snapping into place between us was completely deafening. It was 1,000 times deeper and darker than anything I had ever imagined. A triumphant, earth-shaking growl vibrated from deep within Silas's massive chest. He was loudly claiming his ultimate prize right in front of my abusers. A furious, blood-curdling roar suddenly shattered the stunned silence of the woods. Arthur struggled clumsily to his feet, wiping thick, dark blood from his mouth. His golden eyes were wide with a mixture of absolute disbelief and uncontrollable rage. He had just witnessed his greatest enemy take what he had foolishly thrown away. "Kill him!" Arthur screamed desperately, completely losing all his alpha composure. "Tear him apart for defiling my territory," he ordered his paralyzed warriors. Not a single wolf of the Silver Crescent dared to move a single muscle. They were all completely pinned to the ground by Silas's suffocating, dominant aura. Silas slowly and reluctantly withdrew his sharp fangs from my claimed, pulsing neck. He tenderly licked the twin puncture wounds to perfectly seal my bleeding skin. His massive, protective body shielded me entirely from the hostile, shocked stares. He slowly turned his head to look at the pathetic, screaming Arthur. Silas's glowing silver eyes blazed with a terrifying, lethal promise of violence. "She is no longer a part of your weak, dying pack," Silas stated with chilling calmness. His deep voice echoed like a death sentence through the frozen, silent trees. "She is my marked mate, and the undisputed queen of the blood shadow." Beatrice, eager to prove her new worth to Arthur, lunged forward with a drawn blade. She aimed the deadly silver weapon directly at my exposed, vulnerable back. Silas did not even blink at her desperate, incredibly foolish attack. He simply reached out and caught the sharp silver blade with his bare hand. His thick alpha blood hissed slightly against the burning silver metal. But his handsome expression remained a mask of pure, bored, unyielding stone. With a sickening crunch, Silas effortlessly snapped the solid silver sword in half. He backhanded Beatrice with a brutal force that sent her crashing into the snow. She landed in a broken, whimpering heap right beside her cowardly alpha. The message was instantly and perfectly clear to every single wolf present tonight. To even look at Evelyn the wrong way was to invite instant, merciless death. My exhausted mind was completely overwhelmed by the intense influx of his dark energy. The edges of my vision rapidly began to blur into a soft, comforting darkness. I felt my battered, tired body finally go entirely limp in his strong arms. Silas scooped me up effortlessly, holding me securely against his broad chest. He carried me like an immensely fragile, utterly priceless treasure. He walked away from my old, painful life without a single look backward. He left my arrogant ex-fiancé utterly humiliated in the cold, bloody snow. I do not know exactly how long I drifted in that dark, incredibly peaceful sleep. When I finally fluttered my heavy, tired eyelids open, I was no longer outside. I was lying in the center of a massive, impossibly luxurious four-poster bed. The incredibly soft silk sheets felt like absolute heaven against my bruised skin. A roaring fire crackled warmly in an enormous, ancient stone fireplace across the room. The rich, intoxicating scent of dark pine and wild storms instantly filled my senses. I slowly turned my head, my neck still pulsing with a pleasant, dull ache. Silas was sitting quietly in a heavy velvet chair right next to my bed. He had already washed away the dirt and blood of the violent forest confrontation. He was wearing a simple, dark linen shirt that stretched tight over his chest. His silver eyes were watching my every single breath with terrifying intensity. He looked like a dangerous predator patiently guarding his newly claimed mate. "You have been completely unresponsive for 3 days, my beautiful queen." His deep voice murmured softly, sending a delicious shiver down my spine. I reached up and hesitantly touched the raised, permanent scar on my neck. The mark was hot to the touch, humming with his relentless, protective energy. "Why did you mark me?" I whispered, my voice still incredibly raw and weak. Silas leaned forward, a dark, fiercely possessive smile playing on his lips. "Because, Evelyn, I have been violently hunting for you since the day I was born." I stared at him in complete, breathless shock at his bold, impossible confession. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs like a trapped, frightened bird. "But we are absolute strangers," I managed to stutter out, pulling the silk sheets higher. "And your pack is the sworn, mortal enemy of the Silver Crescent." Silas let out a low, dark chuckle that vibrated deep into the marrow of my bones. He slowly stood up from the velvet chair, his massive frame towering over the bed. He moved with the silent, lethal grace of a true apex predator stalking its prey. "The Silver Crescent is nothing but a pathetic joke to me, little bird." He sat gently on the edge of the mattress, careful not to crowd my trembling space. "Arthur is a weak, blind fool playing at being a king in a tiny, insignificant forest." His large, calloused hand reached out to softly brush a stray curl from my forehead. His touch was surprisingly gentle for a man known entirely for his brutal violence. "He never deserved the brilliant, blinding light of your beautiful, pure soul. I knew you were mine the exact second your sweet scent crossed the ancient border. I felt your devastating pain tonight like a silver dagger plunged directly into my own heart. I would have slaughtered every single wolf in that clearing if they had touched you." I swallowed hard, absolutely mesmerized by the raw, unveiled truth in his glowing eyes. This fearsome, legendary monster was looking at me with nothing but absolute worship. My former alpha had tossed me aside because I could not swing a heavy sword. But this terrifying king looked at me as if I was the only reason he drew breath. "What happens now?" I asked softly, the cold fear slowly draining from my tired body. Silas leaned in, pressing his warm, firm lips incredibly softly against my forehead. "Now, my sweet Evelyn, you rest and heal from the trauma of that fool's rejection. Tomorrow, I will officially introduce you to the Blood Shadow Pack as their Luna. And then, we will begin planning exactly how to make Arthur regret his miserable existence." A wicked, deeply satisfying thrill of vengeance suddenly sparked to life inside my chest. I was no longer the weak, rejected girl crying helplessly on the freezing stone. I was the marked mate of the most dangerous, powerful alpha in the entire world. And I was absolutely going to enjoy watching my arrogant enemies burn. The bright morning sun streamed warmly through the massive stained glass windows of the dark castle. Silas personally draped a breathtaking gown of deep crimson velvet over my bare shoulders. He carefully fastened a magnificent necklace of flawless, heavy black diamonds around my pale throat. "Today, the entire world will know exactly who you are to me," he whispered softly against my ear. He offered me his massive, scarred arm with the perfect, terrifying grace of a true gentleman. I took a deep breath, resting my trembling fingers lightly against his warm, solid muscle. He led me down a grand, sweeping staircase carved entirely from dark, highly polished obsidian. We walked slowly toward the towering double doors that led to the main courtyard balcony. My heart pounded fiercely as the heavy wooden doors swung open to reveal the outside world. Thousands of massive, battle-hardened wolves were gathered silently in the enormous stone courtyard. These were the legendary, utterly ruthless warriors of the dreaded Blood Shadow Pack. They were known globally as the most lethal and unstoppable military force in existence. I fully expected to see doubt, suspicion, or cruel mockery in their glowing, predatory eyes. Instead, the very second my silk slipper crossed the threshold, the entire army dropped. The synchronized sound of thousands of lethal wolves kneeling echoed like thunder against the ancient stone. There was absolute, unquestioning reverence burning brightly in every single pair of eyes looking up at me. Silas stepped forward, pulling me gently against his incredibly strong, protective side. "Behold your new Luna, my beautiful and absolutely perfect mate, Evelyn," his voice boomed powerfully over the crowd. A deafening, earth-shaking roar of absolute loyalty immediately erupted from the massive army below us. "Long live the Queen! Long live Luna Evelyn," the terrifying warriors chanted in perfect, deafening unison. Hot tears of genuine, overwhelming joy pricked my eyes as I looked at my incredible new people. For the very first time in my entire life, I felt truly safe, respected, and deeply cherished. Silas turned to me, holding an ancient, intricately carved crown forged of dark silver and moonstones. He gently placed the legendary artifact upon my dark hair, permanently sealing my undeniable status. "You are the absolute beating heart of this pack now, my sweet bird," he murmured softly against my lips. While I was being crowned a beloved queen, a dark, catastrophic disaster was violently unfolding for my enemies. Miles away, in the pathetic, shivering territory of the Silver Crescent, mass panic had already begun. The ancient, magical protective wards surrounding Arthur's borders were rapidly collapsing into dust. The sacred winter crops had instantly withered and turned to black ash the exact moment my bond was severed. Arthur sat furiously on his carved wooden throne, his golden eyes bloodshot, wild, and utterly panicked. His chosen new mate, Beatrice, stood helplessly beside him, offering absolutely no comfort, magic, or power. "What is happening to our sacred land?" Arthur roared desperately at his trembling, terrified council of elders. The oldest, wisest elder stepped forward, leaning heavily and sadly on his polished wooden staff. "You foolishly rejected the true daughter of the moon goddess, Alpha Arthur," the old elder rasped bitterly. "Evelyn's pure, ancient bloodline was the only thing keeping this weak pack's magic completely alive. By violently casting her out, you have completely destroyed the foundation of the Silver Crescent." Arthur's handsome face drained of all color as the horrific reality of his catastrophic mistake fully set in. He hadn't just thrown away a beautiful girl, he had literally discarded his pack's only chance of survival. A sickening, heavy knot of immediate, suffocating regret formed tightly and painfully in his stomach. He suddenly remembered the flawless, radiant beauty of my face as I kneeled weeping in the cold snow. He suddenly remembered the terrifying, absolute, godlike power Silas had displayed in the dark forest. "She legally belongs to me by divine right," Arthur shouted desperately, driven entirely by pure, blinding panic. "She was born in this territory, and I am the supreme alpha of this land." He was completely delusional, blinded by his own toxic arrogance and profound fear of losing his waning power. "Send our fastest messengers to the Blood Shadow borders immediately," Arthur fiercely commanded his elite guards. "Tell that murdering monster Silas that I demand the immediate return of my stolen property. If he refuses to surrender Evelyn by nightfall, we will declare a full, merciless war." Back at the dark, warm castle, Silas and I were enjoying a quiet, intimately peaceful moment by the roaring fire. Suddenly, Silas's massive head snapped up, his silver eyes flashing with sudden, deeply dangerous amusement. He let out a low, dark, cruel laugh that sent an involuntary but thrilling shiver directly down my spine. It seems your pathetic ex-fiancé has finally realized exactly what he so carelessly threw away, Silas smirked viciously. And he is foolishly sending an envoy right now to demand you back from my hands. He actually thinks he can simply order me to return my own soul to him, Silas continued, his voice dripping with pure malice. I felt a sudden, cold flash of panic at the mere mention of Arthur's toxic, hateful name. Silas instantly sensed my brief spike of fear through our new, incredibly powerful mating bond. He pulled me firmly onto his lap, wrapping his massive, muscular arms securely and tightly around my waist. Do not fear that weak, dying insect for even a second, my beautiful queen, Silas whispered, kissing my marked neck. Let him send his pathetic, trembling messengers to our heavily fortified iron gates. I am going to thoroughly enjoy sending them back to him in several bloody pieces. Arthur is about to painfully learn what happens when you try to steal from the god of death. My previous fear completely melted away, instantly replaced by a dark, thrilling anticipation of total justice. The massive, terrifying iron gates of the ancient, impenetrable blood shadow fortress loomed like a dark nightmare against the grey winter sky. A pathetic, incredibly high-pitched horn echoed weakly and timidly from the other side of the colossal black stone walls. It was the official, deeply cowardly arrival of Alpha Arthur's desperately dispatched envoy from the dying Silver Crescent pack. Silas gently wrapped a thick, incredibly luxurious black wolf fur cloak around my trembling, delicate shoulders to completely ward off the bitter winter chill. He tucked me securely and highly protectively against his incredibly warm, muscular side as we stood together on the dizzyingly high stone battlements. Looking down into the snowy gorge, I immediately recognized Beta Marcus, Arthur's normally arrogant and cruel second-in-command. Marcus was sitting nervously on a shivering brown horse, looking completely dwarfed and hopelessly terrified by the sheer, imposing scale of our dark castle. The overwhelming, suffocating scent of pure, unadulterated canine terror was wafting thickly upward from his trembling body. He was surrounded entirely by our heavily armored, glowing-eyed sentries who were just waiting for a single command to tear his throat out. Speak your pathetic message, little dog, before I lose my patience and feed you to my hounds, Silas's dark, booming voice thundered down the ancient stone walls. Marcus visibly violently flinched, almost completely dropping the rolled parchment he was desperately clutching in his sweaty, shaking hands. He cleared his dry throat nervously, attempting poorly to project an aura of false, borrowed authority. I speak officially on behalf of the Supreme Alpha Arthur of the Silver Crescent, Marcus stuttered miserably, his voice cracking horribly. A deep, rumbling wave of dark, menacing laughter immediately echoed across the towering walls from my thousands of lethal, listening warriors. Alpha Arthur officially demands the immediate and unconditional return of his stolen pack property, the female known as Evelyn, Marcus read, thoroughly terrified. If you do not surrender her to my custody immediately, the Silver Crescent will formally declare a merciless war upon your borders. The absolute, sheer audacity and profound stupidity of those arrogant words hung heavily and dangerously in the freezing winter air. I felt Silas's massive, incredibly powerful body instantly go perfectly, terrifyingly rigid beside me. A low, vibrating growl of pure, uncontrollable, murderous alpha rage began to build deeply within the expansive cavern of his massive chest. The air around us literally began to crackle and violently warp with the overwhelming, devastating force of his dark magic. He was fully prepared to leap directly over the high wall and physically rip Marcus's head from his trembling shoulders. But before my terrifyingly protective mate could unleash his divine, bloody wrath, a sudden, unfamiliar surge of absolute confidence flooded my veins. I was no longer the weak, crying, discarded girl kneeling helplessly in the cold mud of my former home. I was entirely bound to the most powerful king on earth, and his majestic, dark strength was now flowing freely through my own soul. I gently but very firmly placed my small, pale hand perfectly over Silas's massive, tightly clenched, heavily scarred fist. Silas instantly stopped his violent forward momentum, turning his glowing, surprised silver eyes down to my beautifully calm face. I offered him a soft, deeply reassuring smile before turning my piercing, icy gaze back down to the pathetic, trembling messenger below. You may formally tell your foolish, arrogant alpha that I am absolutely no man's property to be casually claimed or traded, I shouted loudly, my voice ringing with undeniable, crystalline authority. He publicly and cruelly severed our sacred bond, completely discarding me like absolute, worthless trash before the eyes of our goddess. I am standing here entirely by my own free choice, and I am the undisputed, fiercely protected lunar queen of the blood shadow. Beta Marcus stared up at me in complete, unadulterated shock, his mouth hanging ridiculously wide open in absolute disbelief. He had expected to see a broken, crying prisoner pleading desperately to be rescued, not a radiant, powerful queen standing proudly in divine judgment. Silas let out a loud, deeply booming laugh of pure, overwhelming pride and intense, dark adoration for my courageous display. He aggressively pulled me tight against his broad chest, planting a fierce, searingly hot kiss directly onto the very crown of my head. You heard my beautiful, perfect queen, you miserable, pathetic excuse for a wolf, Silas roared down at the terrified envoy. Silas did not even bother to physically touch the trembling, cowardly man standing in the snow below. He simply narrowed his glowing silver eyes and violently unleashed a devastating, invisible wave of pure, crushing kinetic pressure. Marcus's horse instantly buckled under the impossible, suffocating weight, throwing the terrified Beta violently onto the freezing, hard ground. The thick, solid silver sword strapped tightly to Marcus's belt suddenly glowed white-hot before violently exploding into 1,000 harmless, melting pieces. Marcus screamed in absolute, blinding terror, scrambling desperately backward through the thick winter snow like a pathetic, beaten insect. Crawl back to your dying, pathetic master and deliver my final, absolute promise to his arrogant face, Silas commanded mercilessly. He has exactly 3 days to formally surrender his entire collapsing territory to my absolute, unquestioned rule. If he refuses, I will personally march my entire, unstoppable army through his weak, crumbling borders. I will utterly destroy everything he foolishly loves, and I will force him to violently choke on his own bitter regret. Now run, little dog, before I decide that your miserable, worthless life is not even worth the breath it takes to spare it. Marcus did not need to be told a single second time. He scrambled frantically to his bruised feet, completely abandoning his terrified horse, and sprinted wildly toward the distant, fading tree line. I watched him run away like a total coward, feeling an incredibly deep, profound sense of healing closure wash beautifully over my damaged heart. I turned back to face Silas, finding his intense, handsome face looking down at me with an expression of pure, unbridled worship. You were absolutely magnificent just now, my brave, beautiful little bird, he whispered softly, his silver eyes shining brilliantly. I cannot wait to watch you completely conquer this entire, pathetic world, he murmured, before capturing my lips in a deep, breathtaking kiss. Beta Marcus collapsed violently across the frozen, dying borderline of the Silver Crescent territory. His once shiny armor was heavily battered, and his entire body shook uncontrollably from pure, unadulterated terror. He crawled frantically through the deep, unforgiving snow until he reached the steps of the main pack house. Arthur sprinted fiercely out of the massive wooden doors, grabbing his bleeding second-in-command roughly by the collar. He demanded to know exactly when the legendary Blood Shadow King would return his stolen, precious mate. Marcus openly sobbed as he delivered the terrifying, absolute truth to his arrogant, delusional alpha. He loudly confessed that Evelyn was not a suffering prisoner, but the worshipped, fiercely protected queen of their greatest enemy. He tearfully relayed Silas's brutal, unapologetic 3-day ultimatum of absolute, merciless destruction. The starving, freezing pack members gathered in the courtyard heard every single, devastating word. The magical, protective wards of their ancestral home had completely vanished into thin winter air. Elderly wolves and innocent young pups were already suffering terribly from the bitter, unnatural cold. They turned their angry, deeply sunken eyes toward their incredibly foolish, selfish leader. The pack elders openly and loudly blamed Arthur for arrogantly throwing away their only divine salvation. They realized that discarding Evelyn's pure, ancient bloodline was the ultimate, fatal mistake. Panic completely seized Arthur's chest as he watched his entire kingdom rapidly crumbling around him. He desperately turned to Beatrice, violently pulling her forward to face the angry, rioting crowd. He angrily ordered his newly chosen, heavily scarred mate to organize the warriors and restore order. But Beatrice was nothing more than a simple, brutal brawler, completely lacking the divine grace of a true Luna. She screamed back at him in sheer, absolute panic, terrified of facing Silas's legendary, unstoppable army. She had absolutely no magical power to heal the dying land or warm the freezing, desperate people. Arthur stared closely at Beatrice's trembling, fearful face and felt a sudden, violent surge of sickening disgust. He realized with absolute horror that he had foolishly traded a priceless, glowing diamond for a totally useless rock. The agonizing, suffocating weight of his immense regret finally crashed down upon his broad, tense shoulders. He had ruthlessly shattered the heart of a perfect goddess, only to crown a worthless, cowardly impostor. But Arthur was a dangerously proud narcissist who absolutely refused to surrender his fading power to anyone. Driven by pure, toxic desperation to keep his crumbling throne, he made a deeply monstrous decision. Late that freezing night, he aggressively dragged the screaming, fighting Beatrice down into the damp, hidden castle dungeons. He ruthlessly chained the terrified warrior woman to an ancient, cold stone altar hidden deep underground. He deliberately summoned a forbidden, highly dangerous blood witch from the dark, toxic eastern swamps. Arthur stared coldly into Beatrice's pleading, tear-filled eyes without a single ounce of mercy or love. He selfishly offered her entire life force as a dark sacrifice to the cackling, twisted old witch. In exchange for her bloody death, the witch promised to erect a temporary, impenetrable barrier of dark magic. As Beatrice screamed her final, agonizing breath, Arthur felt a sickening surge of twisted, unnatural power. This was the incredibly horrific, monstrous reality of the cruel man I had once mistakenly loved. He was totally willing to casually slaughter his own chosen mate just to delay his inevitable, crushing defeat. Meanwhile, miles away in the magnificent Blood Shadow Sanctuary, I was bathed in warm, golden light. I knelt gracefully on a plush velvet cushion in the very center of their sacred, ancient temple. Silas knelt respectfully beside me, holding my small hand tightly in his massive, comforting grip. The ancient, wise elders of his pack softly chanted beautiful, melodic blessings over my bowed head. I closed my eyes and reached deep inside my soul to unlock the pure magic Arthur had always suppressed. A brilliant, blinding white light suddenly erupted majestically from my chest, illuminating the massive stone room. Silas proudly released his own terrifying, swirling dark energy to meet my glowing, radiant light. Our two drastically different magics did not clash, they instantly blended into a flawless, breathtaking harmony. His dark, protective shadows wrapped lovingly around my bright, healing light like a devoted, eternal guardian. I felt 1,000,000 times stronger, more radiantly beautiful, and more deeply cherished than ever before. I finally understood why the wise moon goddess had allowed my first, painful bond to be violently broken. It was absolutely necessary to clear the path for my true, destined, and unimaginably powerful king. Silas stood up slowly, gently pulling me to my feet and placing a soft, reverent kiss on my glowing forehead. His silver eyes burned with a fierce, intoxicating mixture of absolute pride and overwhelming, possessive love. The 3 days are officially over, my beautiful, radiant queen," he murmured, his deep voice vibrating with excitement. "It is finally time to march upon the Silver Crescent and completely eradicate that worthless stain from the earth." I looked up into his handsome, deadly face and smiled with absolute, unwavering, serene confidence. I was completely ready to comfortably ride beside my terrifying monster and watch my painful past burn to ashes. The massive, completely unstoppable army of the Blood Shadow Pack marched silently and ominously through the freezing, entirely dead winter forest. Thousands of gigantic, heavily armored wolves moved flawlessly with the perfectly synchronized, incredibly lethal grace of a single, terrifying apex predator. I rode proudly and elegantly at the very front of the devastating, unstoppable military formation right beside my towering, incredibly handsome mate. Silas was mounted effortlessly on a gargantuan, intimidating pitch-black warhorse that literally breathed actual, visible wisps of hot, dark smoke. I sat comfortably and highly confidently atop a magnificent, breathtakingly beautiful snow-white stallion, completely wrapped in Silas's highly protective, incredibly luxurious dark winter furs. The bitter, painfully biting winter wind whipped my long, cascading dark hair fiercely around my glowing, radiantly beautiful face. We finally reached the deeply devastated, miserably dying borderline of the once proud and magically vibrant Silver Crescent territory. The ancient, once lush, beautifully vibrant green trees were now completely blackened, horribly twisted, and entirely stripped of all magical life. A massive, sickeningly pulsating dome of sickly, deeply corrupted blood-red magic completely encased the main, shivering pack settlement. This was the horrific, profoundly twisted dark shield Arthur had so desperately and cowardly purchased with his new mate's innocent, screaming blood. Arthur stood cowardly and weakly behind the glowing, repulsive red barrier, surrounded entirely by his starving, absolutely terrified, and severely frostbitten warriors. He wore his incredibly heavy, supposedly majestic alpha furs, but he looked unbelievably small, incredibly weak, and utterly, profoundly pathetic. His deeply sunken, horribly bloodshot golden eyes widened rapidly in absolute, paralyzing, and completely undeniable shock as he finally saw me approaching the boundary. I was absolutely no longer the quiet, deeply demure, highly obedient little girl who always kept her nervous eyes glued firmly to the dirt. I was sitting incredibly tall and fiercely, beautifully proud, practically vibrating intensely with immense, undeniable, ancient, and brilliantly pure white magic. A heavy, incredibly magnificent crown of highly polished dark silver and flawlessly sparkling moonstones rested perfectly and securely upon my head. The absolute most dangerous, globally feared, and highly lethal alpha in the entire world was looking at me with nothing but pure, unadulterated, intoxicating worship. A violently painful, intensely agonizing wave of pure, toxic jealousy and deeply suffocating regret violently slammed straight into Arthur's rapidly beating chest. He suddenly realized, with absolute, entirely crushing, and completely irreversible certainty, that he had foolishly, blindly thrown away a literal, walking goddess. "Evelyn!" Arthur shouted desperately, his voice cracking loudly through the incredibly thick, sickeningly pulsating red magic of his twisted, bloody, sacrificial shield. "You must absolutely come back to me immediately and thoroughly restore the dying, fading divine magic of our once glorious pack." His normally arrogant, highly demanding voice was now laced heavily with a thick, deeply pathetic, and completely undeniable layer of sheer, absolute panic. "I have successfully and ruthlessly purged all the weakness from our ranks just to definitively prove my absolute, undying devotion to you. I personally and violently sacrificed Beatrice directly to the dark spirits because I quickly realized she was entirely, fundamentally unworthy of sitting beside my throne." A collective, profoundly horrified gasp rippled violently and immediately through his own starving, freezing, and deeply loyal pack members at his horrific, unprompted confession. They finally realized, with absolute, chilling terror, the truly monstrous, bottomless depths of their reigning alpha's profound selfishness and total, unforgivable depravity. Silas let out an incredibly low, deeply terrifying, rumbling growl that literally shook the heavy, frozen snow right off the dead, blackened pine branches. His glowing, brilliant silver eyes locked entirely and obsessively onto Arthur with a deadly, completely unmistakable promise of immediate, incredibly agonizing, and exceptionally bloody slaughter. I am going to very slowly, very painfully rip his lying, incredibly treacherous tongue right out of his miserable, pathetic throat, Silas snarled darkly, his sharp fangs fully bared. He reached violently and eagerly over his broad shoulder for the massive, incredibly heavy, battle-worn axe strapped tightly and securely to his incredibly muscular back. But I reached out incredibly quickly and very gently placed my soft, pale hand perfectly over his large, heavily scarred, lethal fingers. "No, my fierce, wonderfully protective king," I whispered incredibly softly, giving him a deeply serene, completely confident, and brilliantly reassuring smile. "This particular, incredibly pathetic, and highly cowardly obstacle absolutely does not require your magnificent, overwhelming, and globally legendary physical strength." I slowly, highly gracefully, and with absolute royal dignity dismounted from my beautifully massive white stallion, my soft silk slippers touching the bloody, frozen snow. I walked completely calmly and highly purposefully directly toward the sickening, horribly pulsating red dome of twisted, highly unnatural dark magic. Arthur immediately laughed an incredibly loud, highly harsh, deeply arrogant laugh that echoed terribly and hollowly across the dead, entirely frozen, lifeless valley. "You absolutely cannot possibly breach this incredibly powerful barrier, Evelyn," he sneered highly confidently, desperately, and pathetically clinging to his incredibly false, totally borrowed power. "It is permanently forged from the absolute darkest, most intensely ancient, and highly forbidden blood magic in the entire, completely miserable world." I did not even bother for a single second to look directly at his incredibly pathetic, horribly ugly, deeply sneering face as I smoothly raised my right hand. I simply and effortlessly extended one single, highly delicate, perfectly manicured, glowing finger directly toward the incredibly thick, highly repulsive red energy field. I closed my eyes peacefully and easily tapped directly into the vast, entirely infinite, beautifully glowing ocean of pure, divine white magic resting deep within my soul. Absolutely brilliant, entirely blindingly bright, and highly concentrated beam of pure, incredibly intense moonlight shot violently and directly from my extended fingertip. The exact, precise second my brilliantly pure light beautifully touched the heavily corrupted, horribly bloody shield, the entire massive dome literally shrieked in absolute, deafening agony. The foul, intensely dark magic boiled violently, sizzled loudly, and entirely rapidly evaporated precisely like tiny, insignificant drops of water thrown onto a completely scorching sun. In absolutely less than 3 remarkably short seconds, Arthur's supposedly impenetrable, incredibly bloody fortress completely and utterly shattered into a million, dissolving, harmless pieces. A massive, highly powerful shockwave of pure, beautifully cleansing magical energy violently knocked Arthur and his totally terrified guards entirely flat onto their freezing backs. The incredibly sickening, intensely heavy stench of the forbidden dark magic was entirely and instantly replaced by the wonderfully crisp, wonderfully clean, beautiful scent of fresh, pure winter snow. I stood perfectly, absolutely still, intensely glowing with unbelievable, completely undeniable divine power, looking down coldly at my entirely pathetic, violently trembling ex-fiancé. "Your completely stolen, horribly bloody, entirely fake magic is absolutely, fundamentally nothing compared to the true, overwhelming divine will of the ultimate moon goddess," I stated incredibly coldly. Arthur stared directly up at me in pure, absolute, entirely unadulterated, and profoundly paralyzing horror, finally, truly realizing he had absolutely nothing left in the world to hide behind. The massive, incredibly lethal, and totally unstoppable army of the dreaded Blood Shadow Pack immediately drew their terrifying weapons with a perfectly synchronized, highly terrifying, sharp metallic ring. Silas walked incredibly slowly and highly purposefully to my side, quickly wrapping a highly possessive, incredibly heavy, muscular arm tightly and securely around my small, delicate waist. Now, Silas smiled incredibly wickedly, fully exposing his remarkably sharp, totally deadly alpha fangs to the freezing wind. Let the absolute, completely merciless slaughter officially begin. The deafening battle cry of the Blood Shadow Army violently shattered the frozen silence of the Dead Valley. Thousands of massive, heavily armored warriors charged forward like an unstoppable wave of dark, lethal shadows. They fully expected a brutal, bloody clash against the desperate defenders of the Silver Crescent Pack. Instead, the deeply starved, freezing wolves of Arthur's territory simply dropped their heavy steel weapons into the snow. They fell directly to their trembling knees, burying their faces in the icy dirt in complete, unconditional surrender. They were entirely exhausted by their arrogant leader's endless cruelty and catastrophic, selfish mistakes. They actively chose to beg for mercy from the radiant, glowing queen they had once foolishly allowed to be banished. Within mere seconds, the entire fierce invasion transformed seamlessly into a massive, peaceful submission. Arthur stood entirely alone in the center of the ruined courtyard, surrounded by the kneeling bodies of his own loyal people. His breathing was ragged, heavy, and completely fueled by pure, unadulterated panic and blind, frantic rage. He threw his head back and unleashed a desperate, blood-curdling howl into the gray winter sky. His human body violently twisted, his bones cracking loudly as he forced his final, desperate transformation. A massive, golden-furred wolf materialized in the snow, but its coat was patchy, dull, and entirely lacking magical luster. He bared his long, yellowed fangs and charged recklessly toward the towering, relaxed figure of my Dark King. Arthur foolishly believed that a desperate, surprise physical attack could somehow bridge the impossible gap between their strengths. Silas did not even bother to fully shift into his own globally feared, monstrously large black wolf form. He simply stood his ground, a terrifyingly calm, deeply amused smile playing elegantly across his handsome, sharp features. When the golden wolf violently lunged for his throat, Silas moved with the blinding, impossible speed of a striking viper. He effortlessly dodged the snapping, desperate jaws with a casual, almost bored shift of his broad shoulders. Silas then brought his massive, heavily scarred fist crashing down fiercely against the back of Arthur's thick neck. The sickening, deeply satisfying sound of heavy bones fracturing echoed sharply across the silent, kneeling crowd. Arthur whimpered loudly, his massive golden body slamming brutally into the frozen, unforgiving earth. The once proud alpha scrambled frantically backward, his hind legs trembling and struggling to support his massive weight. He launched himself forward again, completely blinded by toxic pride and the horrifying reality of his total defeat. Silas caught the golden wolf directly by the throat mid-air, entirely stopping the massive beast's forward momentum. His thick, muscular fingers dug mercilessly into Arthur's windpipe, completely cutting off his desperate, ragged oxygen supply. Silas effortlessly lifted the choking, thrashing golden wolf entirely off the ground with only one single arm. He held his greatest enemy suspended in the freezing air, watching the arrogant alpha desperately claw at his iron grip. "You were never worthy of leading a pack, and you were certainly never worthy of touching her," Silas growled dangerously. He violently hurled the suffocating beast across the courtyard, sending Arthur crashing heavily into the ruined stone fountain. The devastating impact forced Arthur to violently shift back into his battered, broken, and heavily bleeding human form. He coughed up thick, dark blood onto the pristine white snow, his ribcage visibly and painfully crushed. Silas walked slowly toward the broken, weeping man, his heavy leather boots crunching loudly in the quiet winter air. He grabbed Arthur roughly by his sweat-soaked hair, dragging his limp, pathetic body across the freezing ground. Arthur left a long, pathetic trail of dark crimson blood behind him as he was dragged toward my waiting white horse. Silas finally threw the completely ruined, weeping alpha directly at my feet, forcing his face deep into the cold mud. The devastating contrast between my radiant, divine glory and his miserable, crawling defeat was utterly breathtaking. I looked down at the man who had once shattered my innocent heart, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, empty apathy. Silas stepped respectfully to my side, wrapping his large, warm hand securely around my delicate fingers. His miserable, worthless life belongs entirely to you now, my beautiful queen, Silas murmured, his voice echoing with absolute devotion. You may grant him the quick mercy of death, or you may let him suffer in the darkness forever. The entire surviving population of the Silver Crescent held their collective breath, waiting desperately for my final, royal judgment. Arthur weakly raised his bruised, heavily bleeding face, his golden eyes filled with a pathetic, agonizing plea for unearned mercy. He reached out a trembling, bloody hand toward the hem of my pristine velvet gown, seeking comfort he no longer deserved. I smoothly stepped backward, ensuring his filthy, tainted blood did not stain the magnificent garments gifted by my true king. The terrifying realization finally washed over Arthur's shattered mind, proving that his ultimate doom had finally arrived. Arthur's pathetic tears mixed freely with the dark mud and bright crimson blood covering his heavily bruised face. He actually had the incredible, staggering audacity to look up at me with hopeful, desperately begging eyes. He foolishly thought the lingering, forgotten ghosts of our childhood friendship might somehow save his miserable life. Please, Evelyn, my sweet Evelyn, he sobbed uncontrollably, violently choking on his own thoroughly broken pride. I was completely blinded by the dark magic and the overwhelming, crushing pressure of leading this pack. You always had a remarkably kind, deeply forgiving heart, please just let me live. His desperate, sniveling, cowardly voice absolutely disgusted me far more than his brutal betrayal ever did. Silas tightened his incredibly warm, highly protective grip around my waist, his glowing silver eyes completely devoid of mercy. He was perfectly, quietly content to let me deliver the final, devastatingly crushing blow to this pathetic creature. I looked out calmly over the hundreds of starving, freezing wolves still kneeling helplessly in the ruined courtyard. They were fundamentally innocent people who had suffered horribly under the cruel, incompetent reign of a deeply selfish tyrant. Your death would be a remarkably quick, entirely painless mercy, Arthur, I finally spoke, my voice ringing purely like crystal. A swift, sharp blade to your throat would entirely end your pathetic suffering in a matter of mere seconds. You absolutely do not deserve the quiet, peaceful rest that death so easily provides. Arthur's golden eyes widened instantly in fresh, overwhelming terror as he quickly realized I was not going to execute him. You arrogantly and foolishly believed that brute physical strength was the absolutely only true measure of an alpha. You openly mocked my gentle nature and violently discarded my pure magic like it was worthless, invisible garbage. Now, I will permanently take away the absolute only thing you have ever truly valued in this entire world. I stepped gracefully and purposefully forward, raising my right hand directly toward his bleeding, violently trembling chest. I did not use any violence or physical force, I simply called deeply upon the divine, ancient authority of the moon goddess. A brilliant, incredibly piercing beam of pure white light violently shot from my palm and struck him directly in the heart. Arthur screamed in absolute, mind-shattering agony as his broken body arched violently off the frozen, bloody ground. His horrifying screams echoed terribly across the dead pines, a chilling, haunting melody of complete and utter ruin. I was aggressively, mercilessly ripping the ancient, sacred wolf spirit entirely out of his corrupted, filthy soul. The divine magic systematically and painfully severed his deep connection to the pack, the sacred moon, and the earth itself. His heavy bones cracked loudly and shifted violently in reverse, permanently locking him into his fragile, highly vulnerable human form. The bright golden glow in his eyes rapidly faded away, replaced completely by the dull, flat brown of an ordinary, powerless mortal. He collapsed heavily back into the bloody snow, violently gasping for precious air, completely stripped of all his supernatural grace. You are absolutely no longer an alpha, and you are entirely no longer a wolf, I declared with chilling, absolute finality. You are nothing but a weak, utterly defenseless, deeply pathetic man facing the brutal, completely unforgiving winter. I officially and permanently banish you to the frozen northern wastelands for the entire rest of your miserable life. You will wander completely alone in the endless ice, permanently haunted by the agonizing memory of everything you carelessly threw away. Two massive, heavily armored blood shadow warriors immediately stepped forward, grabbing the sobbing, powerless man roughly by his arms. They dragged him mercilessly away from the ruined courtyard, his desperate, broken screams fading slowly into the howling winter wind. The arrogant tyrant was finally entirely gone, cast permanently out into the frozen oblivion where he truly belonged. I turned my incredibly calm, radiantly glowing gaze back toward the shivering, terrified survivors of the Silver Crescent Pack. Rise, all of you, I commanded softly, my pure white magic radiating beautifully outward like a warm, incredibly comforting sun. The oppressive, bitterly freezing chill of the dead valley instantly vanished, replaced immediately by a gentle, incredibly healing springtime warmth. Green shoots of fresh, vibrant winter grass miraculously pushed their determined way up through the heavy, bloody snow. The devastated, thoroughly poisoned earth was finally breathing again, rapidly healing from the toxic, deadly destruction of Arthur's reign. You are absolutely no longer bound as suffering slaves to a broken, starving, and entirely dead territory, I announced to the weeping crowd. You are now fully and safely under the absolute protection and highly prosperous banner of the mighty Blood Shadow Pack. Absolutely no one will ever go hungry or freeze in the terrifying darkness under my sovereign reign. The entire surviving population erupted instantly into deafening, completely overwhelming cheers of pure, unadulterated joy and profound relief. Tears of profound gratitude streamed endlessly down their dirty faces as they praised my royal name to the very heavens. The elder wolves of the Silver Crescent wept openly, praising the moon goddess fiercely for her infinite, glorious wisdom. They had successfully traded a cruel, arrogant, incredibly selfish boy for a brilliant, impossibly merciful, divine queen. Silas stepped up closely behind me, wrapping his incredibly strong, heavily muscled arms securely and lovingly around my waist. He rested his incredibly handsome, sharp chin gently on my shoulder, looking out proudly at our massive, newly united kingdom. You are absolutely the most terrifying, breathtakingly magnificent creature in all of existence, he whispered deeply and highly affectionately against my neck. You just flawlessly conquered an entire, massive territory without physically shedding a single drop of innocent blood. I leaned back highly comfortably into his solid, wonderfully warm, muscular chest, feeling completely and utterly at peace with my grand destiny. I gently touched Silas's permanent, searing mark on my neck, feeling it pulse warmly and beautifully with his overwhelming pride. The weak, constantly crying, easily discarded girl from the tragic winter solstice was officially dead and deeply buried in the past. I was Evelyn, the fiercely loved, impossibly powerful, entirely undisputed lunar queen of the absolute greatest pack in the world. I had successfully lost a remarkably worthless pebble, only to be gloriously handed the entire, magnificent universe in return. The joyous arrival of the spring equinox brought an unprecedented era of absolute peace to our newly united territories. The once dreaded, formidable fortress of the Blood Shadow Pack was now brilliantly illuminated by thousands of glowing golden lanterns. Tonight was the official, grand celebration honoring the seamless, beautiful integration of our two massive, powerful families. The harsh, unforgiving winter that had once violently threatened to destroy my entire existence was finally a distant memory. I stood quietly before a towering crystal mirror in the lavish royal bedchamber, observing my own striking reflection. I wore an exquisite, flowing gown woven from the finest midnight blue silk, embroidered intricately with shimmering silver threads. The heavy, magnificent crown of polished moonstones rested perfectly atop my intricate dark braids, glowing softly with divine white magic. I was no longer the frightened, deeply insecure girl who had desperately craved the fragile affection of a cruel, arrogant boy. I was a radiant, universally adored queen, thoroughly cherished by a terrifying king and fiercely protected by thousands of warriors. Strong, deeply familiar arms wrapped gently around my waist from behind, instantly sending a delightful, thrilling shiver down my spine. Silas rested his handsome, scarred chin delicately on my bare shoulder, meeting my gaze directly in the polished crystal mirror. His glowing silver eyes burned with an intoxicating mixture of raw, possessive hunger and boundless, unconditional adoration. "You look breathtaking tonight, my sweet bird," he murmured, his deep, rumbling voice vibrating warmly against my pale skin. He pressed a soft, incredibly tender, lingering kiss directly over the raised, permanent mating mark on the sensitive curve of my neck. The entire kingdom is waiting impatiently down there to properly celebrate their beautiful, deeply merciful savior. I leaned comfortably back against his broad, solid, muscular chest, drawing immense strength from his unwavering, grounding presence. "They are not just celebrating me, my fierce king," I whispered softly, turning my head to brush my lips against his sharp jaw. "They are celebrating the glorious, unstoppable, united future we are actively building together." Silas smiled, a rare, breathtaking expression of genuine joy that completely transformed his normally lethal, intimidating features into pure devotion. He offered his heavy, muscular arm with flawless, aristocratic grace, escorting me slowly down the grand, curving obsidian staircase. The massive great hall was packed tightly with thousands of joyous, beautifully dressed wolves from both former packs. The once starving, freezing members of the Silver Crescent were now incredibly healthy, laughing freely and dancing joyously to lively music. They mingled seamlessly with the fierce, battle-hardened Blood Shadow warriors, sharing rich, vintage wine and abundant, roasted meats. The bitter, toxic, and bloody rivalries that had stained our ancient forests for countless generations had been completely and utterly eradicated. The exact second we stepped gracefully into the magnificent hall, the lively music ceased and a profound, respectful silence fell. Every single wolf in the vast, echoing room immediately bowed their heads in deep, genuine reverence and total awe. There was absolutely no fear in their bright eyes, only a profound, overwhelming gratitude and absolute, unwavering loyalty to our throne. The oldest, wisest elder of the former Silver Crescent pack stepped forward, his aged eyes shining with unshed, highly emotional tears. He carried a beautiful, incredibly intricate chalice carved from pure white bone, overflowing with the sacred, sweet spring wine. To the mighty Alpha Silas, and our divine Lunar Evelyn, the old man projected his rough voice clearly across the completely silent hall. "You generously gave us abundant life when we deserved only ruin, and you brought the goddess's true light back to our dark, dying world. May your legendary, golden reign last for 1,000 glorious, unbroken years." The entire massive crowd instantly erupted into deafening, highly joyous cheers, raising their crystal glasses high into the warm, perfumed air. Silas accepted the sacred chalice gracefully, taking a slow, respectful sip before turning to softly offer the golden rim to my lips. I drank the sweet wine, feeling the immense, joyous, thrumming energy of our newly united people flow directly into my ancient soul. Later that enchanting evening, Silas gently guided me away from the overwhelming festivities and out onto the highest, quietest stone balcony. A magnificent canopy of brilliant, twinkling, diamond-like stars stretched endlessly across the clear, peaceful velvet night sky. The crisp, highly refreshing spring breeze carried the sweet, deeply intoxicating scent of blooming night jasmine and wild forest roses. Far below us, the newly healed, vibrantly green forests pulsed beautifully with the potent, undeniable magic of the moon goddess. Silas wrapped his incredibly thick, luxurious black fur cloak warmly around my bare shoulders, thoroughly shielding me from the cool night air. He turned me gently to face him, taking both of my small, delicate hands securely within his large, heavily scarred, lethal palms. I spent my entire, bloody life believing I was nothing more than a ruthless monster destined to walk forever in cold darkness, he confessed softly. His glowing silver eyes searched my face intensely, exposing a beautiful, profound vulnerability he showed absolutely only to me. But the exact moment I saw you kneeling weeping in that snow, I finally understood the true purpose of my violent, lonely existence. I was forged in absolute, terrifying darkness simply so I could be strong enough to fiercely protect your brilliant, blinding light. Tears of pure, overwhelming, heart-stopping happiness gathered rapidly in my eyes, spilling warmly down my flushed, widely smiling cheeks. I reached up fearlessly, framing his handsome, dangerous face with my hands, my thumbs gently tracing his sharp, rugged cheekbones. "You are not a monster, Silas," I whispered fiercely, pouring every single ounce of my deep, ancient soul into the honest words. "You are my magnificent, destined king, my eternal protector, and the absolutely perfect, deeply cherished other half of my divine soul." He let out a ragged, highly emotional breath, leaning down to completely capture my lips in a deeply passionate, earth-shattering kiss. The kiss was a profound, wordless, intensely magical promise of eternal devotion, permanently sealing our magnificent destiny together forever. I closed my eyes, finally and entirely letting go of the last, lingering, ghostly shadows of my painful, highly traumatic past. The arrogant, foolish boy who had cruelly broken my innocent heart was currently freezing alone in the desolate, forgotten northern wastelands. But the legendary, terrifying Alpha who had masterfully pieced my shattered soul back together was holding me like I was his entire universe. The moon goddess had not punished me by violently shattering my first, incredibly flawed and mismatched mating bond. She had simply cleared the necessary, painful path for me to confidently ascend the highest, most powerful throne in the world. I was Evelyn, the triumphant, fiercely beloved queen of the shadows, and my glorious, beautiful reign alongside my monster had only just begun.